Good evening, and welcome to the West Hartford Board of Education meeting. Can we have the roll first, please?
Mrs. Blanks?
Here.
Ms. Exum?
Here.
Dr. Greenberg?
Here.
Mr. Paul Yu?
Here.
Mr. Zdanowitz?
Here.
Student Representative Grace Andrews?
Here.
And Maddie Pliskin?
Here. Jay is away on business, and Mark Overmeyer Velasquez will actually be here. He's just running late because of work, so he apologizes when he sneaks in. Okay, pledge. I should write down who did it last so that I don't have to keep embarrassing myself. But who's? Okay, thank you.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, we have no revision to the agenda order. Do we have student participation tonight? Oh, we do. Oh, I thought you said yes. Okay. No. Alas, because that's always the best part. Okay. Yeah, that's right. You have to get practice. We do have public communication. I have one person on the list. I don't know if anyone else also wants to address us. But as you know, we're open to anybody. We don't respond to comments, but you have up to 3 minutes. So Bill Fisher, come on up. And the microphone's already on, so you just have to state your name and your address.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Bill Fisher, and I appreciate you folks not playing hooky. Maybe you knew I was going to show up and that'd give you an excuse. But let me just try to be a fast talker, which I'm not. Back in 2005, my mother graduated from Smith College a long time ago. But in order to graduate, you had to know how to swim. And back then, with the West Hartford Board of Education, I had a little quote. What good is an education if you can't keep your head above water? That suggestion didn't go anywheres. Now, I want to thank Lisa Daly and Assistant Superintendent Morrow for being so courteous to me. I really mean that. And I also know how hard you folks work, how many hours you put in, and how you unselfishly serve the people of West Hartford. How do I know that? I'm not a clairvoyant. My brother Jeff Fisher served on the West Hartford Board of Education previously for 6 years. Now, to bring us up to date, I want to reintroduce that in order to graduate from Hall and Conard high schools, you got to know how to swim. Just a couple of laps of the pool. Now, thanks to my brother Jeff, I talked to him a couple of days ago. What you can do logistically and cost effectively is have certified swimming instructors at Cornerstone, the north part of West Hartford, the Jewish Center. They have them there. They have a pool. Those are indoor pools. University of Hartford, West Hartford indoor pools, if necessary, where I went, the Hartford High School. So what Jeff's suggestion is to spread it out over 4 years. In other words, freshman, sophomore, a freshman would have 4 years at Hall and Conard to pass the swimming test, a basic, simple swimming test. Freshman, sophomore, 3 years, junior, 2 years, seniors, 1 year. And so that could be done cost effectively, and that gives 4 years, right, to the freshmen and so on, to pass a simple swimming test. Not everyone goes to college, by the way, that graduates from Hall and Conard. Now, what I'm asking is to have a card issued to all students, freshmen, sophomore, junior, seniors at Hall and Conard, have that stamped by a certified swimming instructor that you already employed. And the other thing I wanted to mention is you have, very quickly, you have 4 accessible indoor pools. You have Cornerstone, you have Mandel, JCC, Jewish facility, north end of West Hartford. You have University of Hartford, Hartford High School. You have 4 outdoor pools, Beachland, Fern Ridge, Kennedy, Walcott Park. Okay? So this is a safety issue. You have, I think, something like $166 million budget. And this can be implemented, thanks to my brother Jeff, over 4 years. Now,
You come to the end of your 3 minutes, sir.
the thing I want to emphasize is immediately, you could ask parents of seniors at Hall and Conard, do their children know how to swim? And it's a small percentage. It's probably 5% of, say, 700 roughly students, combined Hall and Conard seniors, that don't know how to swim. So you're talking 35, 40 students. Teach them how to swim.
Thank you.
So-
Your time is
Okay.
up, but thank you very much.
But thank you for letting me visit. Good luck, Ms. Daly. Thank you for your help.
Anyone else? Okay. Moving on to unfinished business, of which we have none. And then new business, the ratification of the West Hartford Board of Education Professional Employees Contract. So the recommendation, I guess I'm looking for a motion, is that the Board of Education ratify the negotiated contract between West Hartford Board of Education Professional Employees, SEIU, CSEA, Local 2001, AFL-CIO, and the Board of Education for the period July 1st, 2016 through July 30th, 2021. I have a motion? Second? We have to make the motion, then we hear them, and then we vote.
Second.
Okay, discussion.
Good evening, everyone. So before you for approval is the ratified agreement with our professional employees. Professional employees is a group of 32 employees, and they represent members of our Information Technology Department, our Budget and Business Office, Transportation Office, Human Resources Office, a number of administrative and executive assistants around the district, as well as our registrars at our 2 high schools. The original agreement expired on June 30th of 2016, and we did bargain in good faith with the negotiating committee last school year. I wouldn't describe the negotiations as contentious at all, but it was certainly challenging given the uncertainty with our state budget. And to the credit to our negotiating committee, the professional employees, there was a recognition of the tough economic times that we were facing and a real willingness to cooperate with us. So it did take a little bit of time to get to where we are tonight, but there was a lot of discussion, a lot of cooperation, and a lot of collaboration on an agreement that we felt comfortable bringing to the Board of Education this evening. So the contract you're voting on is a 5-year contract. However, there is a reopener after 2 years. So for all intents and purposes, it's a 2-year agreement that would expire on June 30th of this fiscal year. In the next 3 years, we would reopen wages, health care, and pension. So we'll talk a little bit first about the wage package. It is, there's a 1.5% general wage increase that goes retroactive to July 1st of 2016. A 1.5% general wage increase that goes retroactive to July 1st of 2017, and then that expires on June 30th of this fiscal year, and there's a reopener. So we will sit down at the end of this fiscal year and renegotiate wages with this group. The average general wage increase for non-certified bargaining units with both the schools and the town over the same 2-year time period was 2.25%. So this 1.5% is significantly below the average 2.25% increase that other similar bargaining units have received for the same time period, 2016 and 2017. The professional employees also agreed to significant healthcare reform. That will save us approximately 15 to 17% of our healthcare costs. So effective with the next open enrollment time period, the professional employees will be required to participate in the high deductible health plan, joining our teachers, administrators, and nurses as the other groups who are participating in the mandatory high deductible health plan. Plan calls for a $2,000 individual deductible and a $4,000 family deductible. The board will fund 50% of that deductible, and the employees will increase their premium cost share up to 16% for that high deductible health plan. Like our wages, the deductible, the board's funding of the deductible, and the premium cost share are all subject to the reopener. So at the end of this fiscal year, we will be back sitting down to discuss health care. In terms of pension reform, the professional employees agreed to increase their pension contribution retroactively to July 1st of 2017, up to 4.5%. And again, like our wages and our health care, the pension is subject to the reopener. So later this year, we will sit back down and renegotiate pension, health care, and wages for the upcoming 3 years that would extend beyond June 30th of 2018. So before we get to opening this for questions from the board, we want to take a moment to recognize our professional employees for not only the value that they provide our district, working day in and day out to help our district operate smoothly and effectively, but also for their willingness and cooperation to work with us on an agreement that addresses the 3 key drivers of our budget: our wages, our health care, our pension. We do that in the short term with the 2-year piece of this agreement, and we'll do it again in the long term when we sit back down later this year to negotiate all 3 areas again as we move into the next 3 fiscal years. So that summarizes our presentation. We'd be happy to answer any questions that the board had prior to voting.
Rick, I'm sorry, I know you mentioned it on the top. I was looking at something. Who's in this piece again?
So it's our 32 employees. So it's our IT department for the most part, members of our budget and business office, members of our transportation department, members of our human resources office, a couple members of our human resources office, and then administrative assistants and executive assistants from around the district. So each of our secondary schools has a administrative assistant, and we have a couple of executive assistants as well. And then our 2 registrars, one at Conard, one at Hall.
All right, thanks. And then I know that we, as a board, have members that sit on the teacher negotiations. Just walk me through why we sit on that one and not some of the other negotiations like this one.
It comes down to the dollar amount, really. Certainly, that could happen if you wanted to sit in on all of the negotiations. That could be something that you certainly can take part in. But historically, the board has always sat in on the teacher negotiations because it's a, $60, $70 million line item for teacher salaries, so it's the driver of our budget.
Just in context, this year, how many contracts are up?
All contracts, we will be negotiating with all, except for teachers, administrators, and nurses, every other contract is up this year.
So it's constant negotiations that go on in these off years when negotiations are coming up, so that's part of it too.
And I
You're
guess-
welcome to, certainly.
No, listen, I know there's a lot and, we're all busy. When I hear that, it hasn't been rectified since over a year, I'm really curious on the details of why and, maybe not so contentious, but what was the, what were the bargaining holdbacks? It's just something I'd be curious, and I don't know if we want to talk about it here or not, but.
We certainly can, yeah.
So.
We'd be glad to talk about it. So we, a lot of the time, we start the negotiation process, just to give you a little historical perspective. We'll sit down and we will exchange proposals, so that'll be one meeting. And then we will spend a lot of time educating the other side on the challenges that we're facing. So, and every time we sit down and negotiate a new contract, we're talking about wages, healthcare, and pension. Sometimes you have operational issues that we'll discuss, but those are the 3 drivers almost nearly every time we're sitting down and negotiating. And we spend a lot of time talking about going through our actuarial evaluation so they understand why we need to make some changes to our pension. We go through our retiree healthcare evaluation reports and talk about why we need to look at our, healthcare costs. And so it's just a lot of education, a lot of listening, and then you get into the exchanging of proposals. And what made this, and it's going to be difficult in the coming months as we negotiate with all of our other bargaining units as well. It's just a tough time to sit down across the table and negotiate these things because we're talking about real low wages, and we're talking about changes to healthcare and pension, which no one's really loving to have those kinds of conversations, but we have to have those changes in order to address those 3 key economic areas. So in this case, we spent a lot of time just going back and forth, and there was never digging in and fighting and getting to a point where we may have to bring a mediator in. It was really a cooperative and collaborative type of process. I don't know if you two would describe it any differently. Yeah.
Can I just ask, I'm sorry, just for clarification, so you 3 are the negotiating group?
We are.
Okay.
Yeah. This one's different. Yeah, it's not like the teacher.
Just for clarification, is it a 5-year contract all the time? Or is it, the reason I'm asking is, so after 2 years, and if there's 3 years of reopeners, why isn't it a 2-year contract or something? I'm just curious how.
Right, so generally
That's
we do
determined.
look at 3- and 4-year type of contracts. With this one, because we really, there's no state budget. And we all know that, and we've been talking about that, and we don't know what the future holds for us. So we felt the best way to get to some kind of agreement with them was to agree to some retroactive agreement that brought us to where we are today, gives us time to see where we end up with the state. Ideally, we'll know much sooner than the spring where we'll end up from the state perspective, and that gives us a lot of information to sit back down with them and say, here's the reality of what we're dealing with, here's what we need to do with wages, here's what we'll need to do with healthcare, and it just gave us an opportunity to kind of pump the brakes a little bit and sit back down.
And it actually really is just a 4-year contract. It's just because of the nature of the timing. By the time things got done, it was the end of the 16-17 school year. So we just said, okay, let's make it 1 year was already in the books, essentially, because we knew we weren't going to get it done before the end of the year. So it just made it a 5-year deal. And then Rick said, as Rick indicated, we just said, okay, well, we can only agree to the first 2 because we don't know what's going to happen. By that point in time, the budget for 17-18 was set, but we all knew that 18-19 was going to look very challenging.
Quick question for me. The longevity, would you just go into that a little bit, please?
Yep, so employees at different ranges of service with the school district will receive a longevity bonus. So someone at 20 years would receive a $800 longevity, what's referred to as a longevity bonus. So when they hit 20 years, they'd receive an $800 payment. And there's different categories. I think there's 15 to 19, 20 plus, 10 to 15.
5 to 9, 10 to, 5,
Yeah.
10, 15, and 20, I think they're 4.
So it's an annual thing. So for example, after 20 years, you get 800, but now you're saying 900. Then a year after, you'd get 800, or now you're saying 900, et cetera.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I have a follow-up. So that's interesting. I didn't really know, thanks for answering that question, because I didn't really know what that was either. So at 20 years, usually you're at your higher end of your salary range, so the 1.5 means more than it does 20 years ago. And you have a nice increase versus what you did when you first started at 1.5.
Mm-hmm.
Plus the longevity on top of that every year after year.
Yep, that's built into
Okay.
the budget. And what happens is on our salary scales, and you'll see this in a lot of our bargaining units, some anyways, when they have the steps and they reach the top step, there's no more, you kind of reach your earning potential and all you get is the GWI. You don't get any kind of merit increase for a job well done. And this is that opportunity to provide a little bit of a merit for these folks on the higher end. Yeah.
Although you're also saying you get it, say, after 10 years or whatever. It's not just the people at
No,
the
it's
higher
just
end.
not,
who've-
yeah, there's different categories that have to.
So, I mean, you're still getting step at that point.
Yeah,
There's-
I mean, the best way to think of longevity is you have a salary scale, which is a 10-step salary scale. So in year 1 in the job, you're paid X, and year 10, you're paid whatever that's on the scale. If you happen to be, once you, in addition, so those are new people coming in, so they're going to get the TEPS, it's just part of the compensation. So if you've been here longer, you get paid a little bit more than someone else who's on the same step as you. That's all's really the difference is. It's all just, even though we report it separately, we calculate it as part of the compensation package when we're trying to compare equivalent wage increases across groups.
Yeah, and notice this is a negotiated increase, and this isn't something being created. This is something already in the contract, so.
And I just have one other question, actually. Everything else that I wondered has been clarified by other people, so thank you. But you said that generally people get 2 1/4, but this is 1.5, right? The increase.
Yes.
So people are getting 2 1/4 each year, or total? Because
No,
this is
the
1.5 per
the
year.
wage increase, the average wage increase for our other bargaining units for that same time period, 16, 17, 17, 18, was 2 1/4 each year.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay.
Sorry, one more. Wage increase, longevity, it's a bonus, right? And probably gets taxed on a bonus because it's a separate check.
No, it just adds to that check on your
Okay.
at your anniversary date.
All right. Is that very typical in municipal? It is?
Yes, it's in pretty much all of our non-certified contracts.
Okay.
Other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. All in favor of the board ratifying the negotiated agreement between West Hartford Board of Education, professional employees, SEIU, CSEA, Local 2001, AFL-CIO, and the Board of Education for the period July 1st, 2016 through June 30th, 2021, please say aye.
Aye.
No? Oops, sorry, welcome, Mark. ratification. You're right in time. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, moving right on to the superintendent's report.
Okay, so I guess I'll start with the good news portion. We mentioned at the end of last year the opportunity to move from 11 Wampanoag to the Cogswell building on the ASD campus, and we will be moving and opening up on Tuesday, October 10th. This long weekend, everything will move over, and so our post-secondary programs, Strive, STEPS, and AEP, will have a new location. That's at 139 North Main Street. Any of you, if you'd like to go over and see the new site, physical plant, by all means, Andy and Bob or Gretchen or myself will be happy to take you over and tour you through the facilities. We've got big things planned for it. Once we get moved and it becomes home, we think this really will improve our ability to meet the needs of our kids. So any questions about that before I go on? Yeah.
Real quick, when is it, like, if we saw it tomorrow, is there before, and then if we saw it 6 months from now, be an after, or is it complete and we could walk in and?
It's complete now. You go in, it's complete. There are parts of it that we'll utilize that we're not using yet if we want to expand the program in some areas, the vocational program. But yeah, no, it looks great now.
And I was actually going to ask, so is the kitchen all done? I know you were excited about that part.
The kitchen, we don't have it done yet because we don't have it's done in terms of, it's done, but the program isn't done to meet the needs for it and everything else. We want to move in and get used to the program before we do that. That's something we'll look into in the future.
Great. Other questions about that?
Okay. And this is something, I don't want to steal Craig's thunder, but we won't meet again for 2 weeks. And this is something that you're seeing in the news. And I was on the phone with Tim Sullivan today and Greg Florio from CREC. And they have a building that's not going to be used, and that's not in use, but it's going to be used as a welcome center for any children and families coming from Puerto Rico that will be entering our schools. And by our schools, I mean the area. And I really appreciate CREC taking the lead in this with information for those families about not just where to go for schools, but licensing, all of the kind of information that somebody's coming here might need, and a real headquarters. We're going to meet with them on Thursday. Andy Morrow, Eric Dempsey, myself, talk to them about how we can communicate, how we can best get that information out to people as they come in. We haven't had an influx yet. I mean, Hartford's had some, but we anticipate over the next few weeks that more and more children and families will be coming up from Puerto Rico once they have the availability to even travel at that level. And I would assume West Hartford will be like no other, will be a place where a lot of people are bringing family members or friends, people in need, and we will welcome those children as our own children. Any child under the McKinney-Vento Act, which is basically these children are homeless at this point when they come here, and so under that there is really, they become our students. They are our students, and they are treated that way. And though we don't know the specifics now, we want to make sure that we're ready to ramp up. Andy Morrow's done a really good job overseeing that, and so we're ready for those kids when they get here. Are there any questions about that? Yeah.
Tom, do we have any indication of how many students?
We don't.
No?
We don't.
Because as I heard a statistic that in Connecticut has the highest population of Puerto Rican families, bar none, in the rest of the country. And we definitely, and I'm glad you guys are getting ready for it, because it potentially could, affect us significantly.
We anticipate it'll have some impact here. We don't know how big it will be. And I don't know the statistics. I know New York City has an awful lot too. But Connecticut, there is no doubt, has a significant population. And so we'll be ready to welcome those kids.
Tom just said, I don't know the exact statistics, but that's the largest per capita number of Puerto Ricans.
Yeah.
First New York, then Miami, Florida area, and then Connecticut. But because we're the third largest in the country, and then Chicago's there somewhere, we're going to be receiving a lot.
Absolutely.
As a state.
Yeah.
And actually, I was wondering, the consequence then could be a significant number of kids, even a significant number of kids in a class. Are we ready, or are you thinking about adding staff if that's necessary, or how are we going to
Well, the next thing I'll bring up will be budget. We're not in a position to add staff. We'll balance the best that we can. But
Don't we have to meet certain standards?
we have board guidelines. We're not going to be in a position where we're putting 38 kids in a class. That's not what I'm talking about. We can balance by class and overall our classes. If we had to do, let me phrase it this way. If we had to do something, we'll take care of our kids. Now, we're already near class guidelines at a couple grades in a couple places, at class guidelines at a couple grades at a couple places. I'm not anticipating, I could be wrong, I'm not anticipating 50 kids coming in. I don't know what it is. I don't know what that number is. Where we get them, we'll meet their needs the best we can, and we'll seek to balance classes the best we can to make sure that it doesn't impact our own staffing.
Thanks. Anything else? Okay.
So let's talk about budget. And I don't really have a lot of information for you. I've been a part of a group of superintendents that met with Speaker Arasimowicz last week on Tuesday. On Thursday of this week, that same group of us will be meeting with the Republican Legislative Caucus leaders. I'm not sure who exactly will be there. That's early Thursday morning, to talk about what the impacts, both not having a budget and of things that have been bandied about in both Republican and Democratic budgets, not just financial, but other issues that were brought up in the budgets, what impacts those would have so that superintendents have a voice and people understand the impact things would have. As of right now, we're operating under the governor's executive budget, which is inevitably and inexorably the worst possible case scenario for the town of West Hartford. Impact on us right now, we normally wouldn't be getting money from the state. Typically that payment comes between October 22nd and October 30th. It's basically a quarter of your ECS comes in October, a quarter of it comes in January, and half of it comes in April. And so we're short more than $5 million at the end of this month. Now, West Hartford, I say proudly, as a resident, is a very well-managed town, and our schools are well-managed. And I do think that the governor, in some ways, certainly used that against us. He said as much, that he's taking into account what towns have for reserves as he's decided on his executive budget, and West Hartford has reserves. We are well-managed. Our budget planned for this, and I want to remind people, before we get to the point of panic, even if internally we may feel that way, we eliminated 17 positions in the spring. We cut $2.7 million. And in addition to that, because of what happens if we get an influx, there are positions that we haven't filled, including administrative positions on the board side, to make sure we have the leeway in what was a lean budget to be able to add things when we have to. Because we've had to add some things in special education that, like you brought up, Mark, what about when we don't have a choice? What about when there is a mandate that we have to, and we've got to have the leeway to do that. So right now, we're moving forward. We're not adding new positions. We're filling positions that we have that are in special education, teaching assistant positions that need to be filled that are in the budget. We haven't added positions. Like I said, if something came up, we'd do what we could, but we are in a very tenuous state, and not knowing makes things exceedingly difficult because it is very hard to plan. It is very hard to give answers to people. People tend not to like the answer. I don't know. They might like it better than no, but I'm not sure. And so realistically, the governor and others said today that they have to have a budget by October 13th because of a wedding, legislators not being there. That's 10 days away. If that doesn't happen, there's no other vote in October. That means we're into November. And that's not good for us. That's not good for the state. I can tell you that you will be hearing stories from other communities that are completely cash-strapped. That is not the position that we're in right now. That doesn't mean we're not making accommodations. it means we're not in their position that they'll be doing some drastic things soon. So, questions?
Tom, do we have an idea, once the budget is passed, when does the cash start flowing and things get up to normal? So 3 weeks?
It unfortunately, I hate to say this, it depends. It depends on when it passes, what the timing of the pass is. Is it in November? Is there something retroactive? Is October out the window and that quarter of the year payment done? So, I mean, it could be that, okay, there's no payment till January if they make a deal. It could be we'll get the payment out in 2 weeks. And then there's still questions on the municipal side that I'm not willing to answer because I don't know about car taxes and other things that are still up in the air for the people on the town side. And they've, Matt Hart.
They are
yep,
coming.
And Matt Hart, and, we've had discussions with the town manager, and they're making accommodations on the town side also, so.
Tom, you spoke with the majority leader. Have you spoken with our representatives? And what's their feeling? Because, by not supporting this particular budget, it hurts West Hartford. And I'm just curious on what the thought process is there.
I've spoken with all of our representatives pretty much continuously throughout this process. And I've stressed to them the importance of what's happening to West Hartford, what could happen. I feel like they hear it. I feel like they understand it. I can't talk about their individual votes. They haven't described their decision thought process on a vote to me. But I'm in constant contact with them, so they're aware of what those pieces of each of the budgets would mean.
Thank you. You want to end with something uplifting, or?
If you want me to make something up. But otherwise, things are going very well in the school. I will say this. I am really pleased with the way our professionals are operating. There are times when I think people understand now. I think people understand the situation, and I think people are doing their best. And I think people know that the help isn't coming necessarily around that corner, so we need to build our own capacity, especially this year, in terms of what we do, how we work with our kids, what are the best programs to go forward with our kids. And honestly, all of my team, particularly Paul and Gretchen, have been doing a lot of work with our staffs about what we need to be able to do to make sure we can deliver services to students that they need. So it's, there's always, out of bad situations, there are always silver linings that make you proud, and so that has happened.
Thank you. Okay, so this will be more uplifting, I think. Let's move to staff reports and board discussions. The state assessment results on particularly literacy and mathematics. And Mr. Paul Vicinus will talk us through it. Oh, joined by able colleagues.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to present to you tonight. I'm obviously joined here this evening by Carrie Jones, Director of Elementary Education, and Ann McKernan, Director of Secondary Education, and I thank them. It's a pleasure to report once more on our state assessment results. We'll organize tonight's presentation pretty simply into score reporting, let our parents know what information should be headed home in the next week or so. I'll walk you through the overview of our results for both literacy and mathematics. We'll make our typical comparisons to provide some context to that relative to our DIRG and to our state, and disaggregate those results across the various student groups and offer up any conversation. Okay. So as parents have come to expect, we receive individual score reports back each year. The look of those reports is a little bit different than they were last year, so I wanted to just give you a quick visual and remind folks at home that for any child that was in grades 3 through 8 last year that participated, they'll get a report that'll provide them with a scale score, but also an overall level of grade level proficiency, which is now described in 4 categories. Your level 1, not meeting grade level standard, 2, approaching, and then the spots that we hope all students to be able to achieve, level 3, met grade level standard, or level 4, exceeded. As was the case last year, there's also some 2-year data that reflects the student's score and performance level in the previous year on the left-hand side, as well as their more current levels of performance, so that the parents can have an appreciation and understanding of the amount of growth that the student made during the school year. And then on the left-hand side, as has been the case in the past, they will see performance levels for content, knowledge, and skills within the individual areas. So under literacy, that's going to be your reading, your writing, and your listening and speaking scores. And in mathematics, it will be content and procedures, followed by problem solving and communicating reasoning in the subject area. Those mailings are going out from my office by the end of this week, and so parents should expect to receive those early next week. In terms of how we did as a district, our overall performance in literacy was at a 71.2% of students meeting or exceeding grade level standard, which reflects a relatively flat trend of performance over the 3-year period that you can see highlighted in the table. In mathematics, we had 61.3% of our students receiving at or above goal, which is actually up 6.6% from 2 years ago, when math was first named as an area of focus by our superintendent. So the bottom row of the table shows our continued positive improvement when you average across all grade levels and those 2. However, given the flat performance of ELA, the credit really and the focus is on mathematics, where we saw a 3.4% increase from our performance last year. So taking a look at that in a little more depth, we've bulleted out some summary information here, and I know in your packets that you received, you have the individual scores for 2015, 2016. I've averaged those on the left-hand side to reflect a 2-year average performance, and compared it on the right-hand side to our more recent results, and put in our state results on the far right as a general basis of comparison. As discussed on page 3 of that written report, there are apparent cohort dips for literacy in grades 4 to 5 and 5 to 6 when you look at their previous performance and their current levels of performance. So in grades 4 to 5, it was interesting to note that that cohort dip wasn't a true cohort dip. It wasn't that the same students did any worse than they had done in the previous year. It was actually attributed to a fairly large cohort of students that came into the grade level new, the most of which did not reach their grade level standard in that 1 year. In grades 5 to 6, however, it was kind of a mixed bag. We noticed that a fair percentage of that dip was attributed to another sizable group of students that came in. But another piece of that, we found really some curricular reasons behind that we're working on to shore up right now with a focus on writing within 6th grade. Overall, again, though, for our literacy, our overall scores are relatively flat and no change. And as you'll see coming up, we'll give some context to that in terms of how that's not a bad news story per se. We have strong scores in ELA. In math, this is really the highlight of our presentation, our real good news story overall. Similar graphic to represent the percentages of kids in each of the 4 performance bands, with the average of the previous 2 years' performance on the left and the current performance on the right. Similar to English language arts, something I didn't really mention on the previous screen, we do have a healthy cushion. Overall, our performance relative to the state, it's about 16 points in math, about 17 points in ELA. But unlike ELA, where we've been flat for the last 3 years, math is up 3.4% from last year, 6.6% overall from the first baseline of the new assessments 2 years ago. Highlights in math really center around the big gains that we observe in middle school. With a 10% uptick in performance in both 7th and 8th grade, and a 6% uptick in 6th grade. As it's discussed in more detail in the written report, we're really looking currently hard at our 5th grade to identify what are some ways in which we can shore that up, because we do tend to see a dip from grade 4 to grade 5. We've already identified some curricular gaps that we made improvements on over the summer in curriculum writing that are in implementation in classrooms this year. So to give a little context to this, we'll take a look at our growth relative to DIRG B. I think you are all very familiar with how the state identifies demographic reference group, and even though the state discourages comparisons, those are the comparisons that make their way into the media, and they're not something that we shy from because we feel that they're important relative to our community. So these two graphs display the overall performance of 3-year trends for 3 separate groups. The orange line is the DIRG B trend line, the blue line is West Hartford Public Schools, and the gray line is the state performance. So as the graph on the left demonstrates, you can see that relatively flat performance in ELA is the state trend, is the DIRG trend, is our West Hartford trend. And I think that the graphic demonstrates that our scores in blue compare very favorably with that of our DIRG. We're in there pretty tight and doing a nice job with ELA overall. The graph on the right demonstrates the mathematics trends over 3 years, and that's a very different story. It's quite interesting that at the state level, there is a 3-year trend demonstrating decline in performance across Connecticut for students in grades 3 through 8 in their math. Our DIRG has had relatively flat performance overall for 3 years, and in West Hartford, with our increased focus, we are gladly reporting a positive trend in our performance, and as you can see on the far right of that, really closing the gap in terms of our performance level with the DIRG. I believe we cut that gap in half over the course of the last 2 years. To provide some additional context to these DIRG comparisons, it's important to take a look at while West Hartford is located within DIRG B, we're actually quite unique in several ways from our counterparts in that reference group. So this graph attempts to show a lot of information, with one of the greatest differences between West Hartford and DIRG B being one of the best predictors of academic performance, and that is of socioeconomic diversity. So the green trend line is the trend line that demonstrates the relationship between socioeconomic diversity and student achievement on our state assessments. So as, bottom line up front, as the percentage of students in any district who qualify and participate in free and reduced lunch increases, the overall scores and the percentage of students that are meeting goal decreases. So there's 3 things that we want to demonstrate relative to this. In red, are all of the DIRG schools, and then you see West Hartford is specifically noted. So the first thing to note is obviously the clustering of red scores for DIRG schools is in the left-hand side, which is to say DIRG B has a smaller percentage of students in free and reduced lunch, and they're also kind of high up on there, which is to say that DIRG B schools generally have high performance on their state assessments. And this graphic is actually a little bit better, a little bit more precise than the one that was in your board packet. The median trace line demonstrates the average for DIRG B, a percentage of free and reduced lunch, which is 9%. In comparison to West Hartford, whose percentage of free and reduced lunch increased by 1% last year to 21%. So right there demonstrates that we have a much greater diversity in terms of our socioeconomics than does DIRG B. Lastly, we see in terms of the clustering of performance for DIRG B schools and the clustering and the actual performance, we're competitive in general with DIRG B, as those earlier graphs demonstrated, and we're on the high end of performance relative to other districts who have a similar percentage of socioeconomic diversity as ourselves. So the graphic is here. This is part of our diversity that we acknowledge and recognize. It's a challenge that we work hard towards, but it provides us not an excuse, but an important context by which to understand those previous comparisons that we just made to the DIRG schools, and why we feel good about the performance that we're having, and why we want to strive to tighten those gaps even greater. So With that, what we'd like to do is then also look at how we perform among our student groups. Certainly, you know your board goal number 1 is to advance achievement for all students and reduce the disparities between and among groups. So one of the first groups that we always look at is the state-defined category of high needs student group, which combines 3 separate small subgroups: the students with disabilities, our English learners, and students who qualify for free and reduced lunch. So the 3-year trends for each within literacy are demonstrated here, and not unlike the performance overall, we see some generally flat performance. But what is, clearly evident by the graphic is that while the overall performance is relatively flat and maybe has some slight upticks in a grade level here or there, the overall performance has a slight downtick, a modest decline for high needs overall, for free and reduced lunch, and for English language learners, with only the students with disabilities gaining that slight uptick. Overall, our total gap among our high needs group and students not in the high needs group is significant and has remained stable over the last 3 years at 45 percentage points. Very large, something that we recognize we need to do continued work within. Looking at that same story for mathematics, as was the general trend overall, we do see generally a positive trend for most of for our high needs group overall and for most of the subcategories within it, with our English language being the only group that didn't have that same positive trend that was enjoyed. Very pleased by this positive trend, but we'll note one exception. While in general, on the far left, you notice that our high needs group had a increase of 1% over the same performance of the high needs group the previous year, those students not in high needs had a 4% improvement rate. So the gap between the two groups actually widened by 3%. So even though they're performing better, they got outperformed by their peer group. So bottom line on both of these is still lots more work for us to do. And what we also do, especially at the board's request, we promised we would continue to report performance disaggregated by the state-defined race ethnicity subgroups. So here you see a similar graphic showing the 3-year performance of the major groups that have a sizable population here within West Hartford. The difference here being that not only is it grades 3 through 8, but it's also, just for simplicity, math and English language arts combined together. To give this some context, if we start and look at section D of the graph, which reflects the growth of the white students who are the majority peer group for comparison purposes, what you see here is that there is an overall 2.1% increase from the previous year. All right, so the really good news story in this graphic is the comparison of section A, our black students, who had a 4.2% increase over the previous year, thus shrinking the achievement gap among these two groups by 2%. Make sense? All right. With group B, our Hispanic Latino students, they had relatively flat. You can see it's a very small incremental gain, but I'll just call it relatively flat, which unfortunately, based on the comparison group or their majority peer group, means that the gap increased by 2 because they didn't move and their peer group moved up by 2. And then the bad news story in this is that this year, where we had a significant increase with students 2 or more races the previous, they fell back 2%. So in comparison with Group D, that created a widening of that gap by 4%. So bottom line up front, 2 of our 3 groups that we pay attention to in terms of their performance relative to the majority, the gap widened slightly. With one of the groups, the gap shrunk. So what does it mean and what are we doing as we move forward? Really, this is kind of a high-level listing of some of our ongoing efforts, many of which have been consistent efforts over the last couple of years, and all of which have been refined and reframed relative to our continuous observation of our performance and looking at what we're doing and what works, what's provided results, and what are our new areas of need. So we do have focused revision of the written and taught curriculum in response to the grade level analysis of our results. In terms of the taught curriculum, that really is the secret to our success in 7th and 8th grade mathematics. We had a written curriculum that said this is what we should be doing, but when we went in and looked at classrooms and looked at pacing charts and all the same, what we observed was that teachers weren't necessarily following that. They were trying to do a little bit of catch up from last year if they didn't get to this unit or that unit, so they were delaying some of the start of the grade level curriculum. Having identified that last year, we saw some huge gains by just saying, let's just trust the written curriculum and let's make sure that we're teaching on grade level. But that's not to say we've also identified, as we've mentioned in a couple of areas, some places where we need to go in and we feel we need to make some specific changes when we drill down and we look at the performance in a particular content area or a particular skill, such as whether it be a reading or a writing in a particular grade level or a specific area of focus in mathematics. District-wide focus on 3 key instructional practices. This was work that was started in earnest last year that we continued this year. I've already seen evidence of this. I was on some instructional rounds at one of our middle schools this afternoon and observed the principal working with her staff doing some in-depth focus on one of the key areas of instructional practice that we feel will be a driver for increased student learning. Improved progress monitoring of student performance based on revised and better aligned assessment screens. This is some work that Ann and Carrie can talk to you about relative to how we've revamped and refined our assessment practice for progress monitoring in the middle of the year to be able to know where kids are and to be able to make on-the-spot timely changes to instruction. And there again, you asked last time, and I think I told you, so I wanted to just re-emphasize that we've talked with all of our principals and given them 3-year data trends at a teacher level, so that as they're engaged with their goal setting in October, as we're looking at targeted professional development that meets the needs of individuals, that we're able to do that, and we're able to really take advantage of those teachers that have demonstrated huge gains compared to their peer group as well, and have opportunity to go in and visit their classrooms, see what they're doing, and spread that knowledge around. And finally, just continued work in terms of cultural competence and in terms of universal design for learning to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all of our learners at all times. So that's kind of a high-level look, summary of what you read in the report, and at this time we'd open it up to questions and discussion.
Sorry again for being late. 2 questions, well, 1 comment and 1 question. The comment is that if you go back to that graph with the scatter plot, I mean, it strikes me that is the argument for why we need to keep our budget here in West Hartford. The fact that we've increased to 21% yet still have this kind of improvement over time. It feels like this is yet that West Hartford as a model for this kind of work. It's a very powerful image. And we've talked about this before, but even more so now with increase from 20 to 21%. I think it's critical. It strikes me, Paul, first of all, thanks for that. It's a lot of work putting this together. The argument that you make about mathematics as 2 years ago that we've implemented this rigorous attention and focus on improving the mathematics curriculum, and that's, as I'm understanding the argument, it is a payoff that we see this now. So it strikes me, can that argument also carry through for ELA in the sense that if we would do the same kind of focus with ELA that's been flat for so long, could we also do that? And is that something that we're thinking about moving forward? And then we just keep doing that, and then we're at 100%.
Absolutely. I'll make a quick comment, and I'll let Ann add to it because she's been working dramatically closely with our 2 ELA supervisors. A lot of our math gain this year, when you break it down, really had to do with the heavy weight of that is being carried in 7th and 8th grade. And so a lot of the weight of that improvement was based on some curricular modifications that we made, and that's exactly the work that Ann is looking to either replicate or find the parallel solution. So maybe I'll let her just say a couple of fast words about where they are.
Thank you for the question. I do think we can make some continuous improvement in this area. One of the things we notice in visiting classrooms and talking to teachers and leaders is, the standards came at the teachers very quickly. All of them came very quickly. If you remember, you had math standards coming at the same time ELA standards came. Social studies was not far behind, science is now, so they had an overload. And at times you notice that they made some nice adjustments, but like we all do, we can regress to some things that were good that we did in the past. So I really want to re-dig into the standards and make sure our learning curve continues to improve there. Teachers digested a lot of information really, really quickly. It's a good time to go back, kind of rediscover our standards and make sure the instruction that we're giving every day is standards-based and aligned, and that we don't, maybe slip back to some things we did, which were good in a previous generation of testing and of standards, but are less effective today. So our big focus will be looking at instruction through the eyes, again, new look at the standards. I think it will be helpful.
So if I'm on page 4 at the state assessment results, the chart, and if you look at 2014 West Hartford Public Schools math, specifically 07, 08, significantly lower there, right? The 48.1 to 49.7. And then you go into 2015, so if you take the 7th grade results of 48.1 and you go into 2015, 16th, into the 8th grade where they all go, it goes 46.5, and we don't have 2017 results for them because they're in 9th grade. Am I tracking?
I had to get my specs out, so
Okay,
I
sorry. You got it? Right.
So I'm looking at the cohort from grades 2014-15, 2007, 48.1.
Right.
Moving over to grade 8 in the following year at 46.5.
Right. And then, so if we just use that as an example, we would assume that the 8th grade 49.7 would have went in high school as a deficiency, and then in 6th grade the 50.7 goes into the 7th grade at 52%, and then goes into 8th grade at 56%. You see, there's some improvement there. And I know you guys are tracking this, but this looks significant. The results.
Absolutely. So if you track that, and I would say that, so where we named math as the focus in 14-15, when we got those results, we got that 48.1, that 49.7. We at that stage named math as the area of focus, and so in 1 year's time, the first picture of those results was going to be the 15-16. And so really, when we look at the cohorts, if we look from 14-15 as to where they were to what you can see in 16-17, and you especially see that payoff, as you just mentioned, the 7th grade 52.6 going to the 8th grade 56.7, the 6th grade basically 57% jumping up to 60.5. Anytime I'm seeing 3 percentage points or more, I'm paying closer to attention to that than a fraction of a percent or a 1% up or down kind of a thing, and especially where I'm seeing it in multiple grade levels. So that is the first time that certainly we're breaking the mold from a downward trajectory as they advanced from 6th grade to 7th grade to 8th grade to an upward trajectory as they advanced in those grades, and it's one of the things that we are most pleased about.
No, I get it. I get the results for the ones that you're pleased about. I'm talking about the 07 or 7th grade 2014, where it goes from 48.1 to 46.5. That's more than 2.5%. And I'm now, are we tracking that in high school? I guess.
Oh, so where are they as high school?
That's
Thank
right.
you.
Yeah, I get the results that went well.
Certainly.
Here's an example where it didn't go so well.
So,
and then I go back to my
earlier
question from the other meeting.
So I did some homework on your earlier question, just to be prepared in case you should ask. And mind you, it's a different assessment. So our assessment, and we have 2-year data in 9th grade for the PSAT. And what I can report is that for last year's 9th grade group, and the previous year's ninth grade group. In terms of, because when you had asked the question the first time, there was this specific cohort that was of concern, and the question was, did the gap tighten up? And so the answer to that, and I've lost the specific statistic, but the answer was yes. Those two ninth grade groups, when looking at their mathematics scores on the PSAT 9 over the last 2 years, the cohort of concern had tightened to within, I can't remember if it was a point and a half. Yeah, it was about a point, so they had caught up. And now what will be interesting will be, I believe, if I've got this math correct, that when they take the PSAT coming up in October, that will be this ninth grade group will potentially be the first time we can really now say, okay, so are they going up from that measure? So they shored up that difference to where there's now not a gap. And so what I have is I have a good 2-year baseline, but I don't really have an answer of, okay, so is that a phenomenal score? Is that an average score? Is that an above average score relative to West Hartford performance? I can benchmark that all day against PSAT national, but just like we had our SAT presentation, we blow Connecticut numbers, we blow national numbers out of the water. So I need to know, what does that look like relative to West Hartford?
Here's, I think, another good example to this cohort to track as well, because we lose it off to 2016-17 because they're already in ninth grade. So
Absolutely, and I would say that we've got, that's something that if you'd like, we can look at board reports in the future in terms of how does it translate over to the PSAT, because we'll know, we've got a good baseline now that we can say, because that's a brand new assessment all by itself. What would we anticipate performance to look like based on correlating the smarter to the PSAT?
I'm looking at, on page 7, the performance by race and ethnicity. And thank you for the report. I do realize that this is an assessment, but it does tell a lot. I mean, we decide how to change and focus on curriculum based on results. And it's wonderful to see any improvement in the gap. So under the black student category, 4.2%, I think you said. And there's the decrease with Hispanic and 2 or more races. One thing is, what have you been able to tease out at all? What is responsible for the 4% increase, but then still the gap is huge? And looking at, so the second question is, what more do we need to do? What is responsible? Because we have so many resources and so many things we've looked at over time, but the gap persists. And I know that's a huge question. But when I look at it, it really bothers me. It's troublesome that it's such a large gap, and particularly decreasing in those areas for the Hispanic and 2 or more races, and even the 4% increase is still huge. So
And if I can just piggyback on it, it's higher than the gap, it's greater than the gap with the free and reduced lunch, so it's not an economic issue either. So there's something else going on.
No, it's not. It was interesting to see that the free and reduced lunch, the gap is much different. Here's one of the things that made the difference. Truthfully, when you look at that data on the chart on page 7, and you look, and I provided you more detail there in terms of, you can see the gaps for literacy and for mathematics, and generally you'll see, there are still some of those same things, that overall literacy performance in general for the whole population in the district was relatively flat. Mind you, it's at a higher starting spot than mathematics. And mathematics, you see, generally speaking, and certainly true among your, if you look at the far right column, your difference from the 2-year average, you're seeing, those are the areas where you're seeing your big numbers of increase across all of your different subgroups. So I think a lot of the change there can certainly be explained by the curricular differences. And I think that in terms of how do we provide for demonstration of our efforts working along these other lines, some of that's incremental and some of that may be hidden by other things. So in terms of incremental, I can ask Carrie to talk through some of the changes that we've made specific to a marriage of ELA and social studies at our younger grade levels to make sure that the resources are well aligned and providing for really that reflection of our population so students see themselves in the curriculum. That's a hard thing to tease out in terms of what's the 1 year or 2 year. So what else is confounding it? And to your point, yeah, it's not necessarily socioeconomics, but I'd reference you over on page 8, and that's something that I should probably look at. This is the second year we provided that analysis to say a huge driver for us is years in the district. The gaps that you see there just from a 3-year stint in the district versus not in the district, and it would be interesting to now break this apart from race, ethnicity, to understand who are newcomers. Because that was, when I was looking at that dip in literacy in 4th to 5th grade, there were 52 students that were new to the district that did not have a 4th grade test. And it was a very high percentage of them that were scoring on a level 1 or 2. I believe it was a 60% or something. I know it's in the report. Which speaks to, what do we need to look at more closely in terms of our intervention for kids that are new? But, I know Carrie can talk to you all day about caseloads for tutors and how we're trying to support kids, but it's not an overnight fix. And I think that's part of the puzzle. But I do want her to speak to, because we've done some dramatic things relative to our resources to try to make sure kids can see themselves in the work.
So 2 pieces. Hi, good evening. One is, as you mentioned, Paul, and it came up earlier with Ann, with all the curricular changes we've made in elementary, all of those standards changes over the past 8 years have impacted elementary teachers. So we've worked hard to say, as new standards are coming in science and social studies, how much can we integrate and make the learning authentically integrated. So if we are reading texts in 4th grade social studies, that we are either finding or creating our own. As I think Tom mentioned last week, we've actually written text, done our own research, and included teacher research and hopefully eventually student research as part of that. So we really want our text to be, both mirrors and windows for our kids. And so, we've concerted effort, and that tie to social studies in the upper grades particularly is a very natural tie. We're going to be looking at social studies in the primary grades over the coming year. So as we think about our civics curriculum, our cultural competence, our thinking about having texts that reflect kids and families, diverse children, we really will tie that to our social studies curriculum very tightly. In terms of the intervention piece, actually, and it's something we will be looking into, but I know for some of our funding streams, even for tutors, I need to provide outcomes data. And I've looked hard at math over the last few years in elementary, and indeed, the trend of the longer students are with us in intervention, the longer they are with us from the beginning, and then as we have them in intervention, both in literacy and mathematics, I looked more specifically at math recently, we find kids closing that gap. So I would agree with Paul that a student arrives in 4th grade without the foundational literacy or mathematics skills, we're catching them up. It will take us a bit longer to do so, but the quality of our intervention, I would contend, stands because the students who've been in intervention over the course of their early years with us do tend to close the gap. So I think it's something we have to look harder at, but certainly we have some evidence that the interventions themselves are not the concern. It's really how do we think smart about coordinating services for children. If you have ESOL services and intervention and math and literacy in Tier 1, what's happening in the classroom, how do we think smart about coordinating those things, particularly for older children? We want them with their classmates as much as possible.
If I could, Cheryl, just to add context also, I'm glad we got to that slide that's on page 8 here about years in the district and performance. This is one of the things I'm most proud of, that board meetings are different in board reports, I think, than they were 10, 15 years ago, and that you don't have to dig to find what we're not doing well. And I shouldn't even say what we're not doing well, where our struggles are. We're upfront about it because it's our focus, and we're going to mention this just like we did math in the past, at the risk of always sounding like there's something wrong, because you also want to celebrate to make sure people have confidence in what we're doing. With that being said, one of the key differences between us and those Derby schools, when you see there, is a transient population that they do not have. I mean, we have differences within buildings in our district where it's 60 kids and it's 60 kids, but that's 60 kids, 20 of them are different from September and March. And that definitely has an impact, and it's something that we look at a lot. But I do want to contextualize one other thing. All of these questions that you're asking, that we're looking at, that was one of the key pieces of focus this summer. And as we came back with all of our principals, and Ann and Paul met with all principals to go through data deeply and also give them time, and we wanted them report back on what are your issues, or what are the things you need to focus on in this building, down to the teacher level, down to what's really happening and what are the questions this brings up. And that's really how we started this school year, talking about school development plans that do focus on these very questions that you're talking about now, to make sure that we're not leaving things behind. And I do think it works nicely with our cultural competency work that Rosina's overseeing. That's a key part of every building's professional development. We can't just pretend it's the curriculum. And a curriculum shift's going to make that difference because it's improving, but it's not uniform. So, okay, there's something else going on. And I think that's something that we don't shy away from. So I just did want to bring up that point.
So early intervention doesn't happen within a few days, right? There's a process. And Paul, you mentioned how many students that came in that we didn't have from the beginning? There were.
So it varies by grade, but I believe the number in my head is 52 in grade 5 and 47 in grade 6.
All right, so let's just use those for an example. So instead of having to go through this intervention process, you already have the outcome data. You know, the outcome data is the school systems these kids are coming from and coming into West Hartford. There's your outcome data. Why not intervene immediately with those kids? Because there's a trend that exists, and it's easier to get them off the train than on it. So if that student comes in from that said district, intervention right away, you know what? We don't need to intervene. Rockstar moves on, but 99% of the other kids do. So there's not a big cog in a wheel trying to get intervention. You have the outcome data. It's there.
No, absolutely. And this is something I think at elementary, that kind of probably happens more naturally, just because of the way that their interventions are set up. At the secondary, this is something that we've kind of talked about in general. I don't know that we've cracked the nut on how to provide it, because one of the first things you're trying to do as they're coming in is build a schedule, and it's no longer the idea of just finding 30 random minutes in a day that you can plug them into, or 15 random minutes. It's which period, what class do you not provide for them in order to do that. And those 47 kids, it's 50%. So it's knowing and being right about, well, which 50% is it that who needs the help and who doesn't, who's going to do just fine. But it's a valid point in terms of, we know that it's the more transient population, it's kids that haven't been with us for a long time, that are red flags for us, that we need to make sure that we need to be watching them, we need to be able to provide them services, and to your point, how do we provide them services as quickly as possible so that it's not waiting for them to surface a year later and you lost time.
And I think you make an excellent point. We try to identify them as soon as possible. We do placement tests depending on subject later, and the difficulty there is we have some kids coming in with A in honors English, and that's not our placement. That's not where we think they are. It may be, but there's also a resistance from sometimes parent and child. Okay, well, where do you fit here? And that's where we really need to support those kids, because the fact is, this is something I've heard time and time again, and I bet you guys would both say this, not to put words in your mouth, from friends that that have come from other places. It's harder here. And that's a struggle for some of the kids that have come in from places. So really working on those transition, making sure we have plans is something we're trying to do more of. But because that is a factor, you're absolutely right.
So let me ask, I'm sure there's some state law about this, but they take the assessment test and, okay, West Hartford's harder, right? Can you put them in the appropriate grade instead of going into 7th? Can you say, listen, your student would really be successful, and we can provide that success for you in 6th grade versus 7th?
I'll defer. I'll say a couple things first. It's not always as simple as that. We want kids in the appropriate placement, without a doubt. But you don't want a kid with his learning permit in 8th grade. There are certain things that we want to make sure we have appropriate placements of our children. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that happens? Because it could be, your question's actually a really good question. It depends. Kindergartner versus a 12th grader, there's a lot of variance. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely strikes at the heart of different philosophies relative to, age-appropriate placement or skill-based placement. And and when I say different philosophies, I don't mean this side of the table and that side of the table. I mean parents and educators and any number of other things. What I wanted to say about it was, you take each of those cases individually, and we've done that. I can tell you of an instance where we had a student coming in from out of district, and they were scheduled to go at this level, and my office got involved because the school called up and they had any number of concerns that they were significantly behind grade level and this and this and this, and we ended up talking with the parents and said, because they were going in, I think, it was a question of going into a 9th grade year or an 8th grade year, and they didn't really have a peer group, so it wasn't going to be this big social, emotional problem. And we talked to the family and said, we think that we can provide you with better supports in an 8th grade year for your child, have them go into 9th grade the following year, and that one worked out. Sometimes, if they know the students and all the rest, there's a whole social emotional piece to it, and sometimes when you look at it holistically, you land on, well, the student might not make for the greatest number in my table this year, but I know if I'm getting them young enough and I know I'm going to have them over X number of years and I look holistically, I'm confident that they're going to catch up. And as long as I'm confident that holistically that's the best decision, then we may do that, because we're not always, it's not always about just the test score, but which is not what you're saying. It's about looking at, well, what about the language? What about the mathematics? What about the social emotional? What about the whole child type of a piece? So it's not to say that we never do that, because I can think of 2 conversations I've had this year on this issue, one of which we said, we got the parent to agree, hey, 8th grade's probably better.
If I can just jump in for a second, I don't want to lose sight of what I think your earlier point was, which I think is really quite significant, is it possible to put something in place that, for example, the first day that a new child comes into the district is devoted to placement, whatever it is. And that's true for everybody, so nobody gets insulted or anything like that, but you know right away what the issue is, and you can deal with it immediately. And exactly as Mark said, if they're fine, then they're fine. But
certainly, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that part of the, we do that as a matter of course already. When students come in, whether that's at a middle school or a high school and at an elementary level, I don't know necessarily at the elementary, but they're generally, I know for middle school and high school, they're sitting down, there's a reading assessment to assess their level, there's a mathematics assessment, and definitely for the reasons that Tom said. It's sometimes a challenge when students coming with records to know how much stock do I put into this. If it's from out of state and I don't know the school district, sometimes students are coming with no records. Sometimes we just want to verify that. At the elementary level, we also have the universal screenings that we use, and they're not just once per year. They're happening. A student that's coming in new, we're going to give it, but then they're being given at least 3 times per year to help us monitor our students on track and making progress as they should be. And the benchmarks for that go up accordingly depending on are we in the fall, the winter, or the spring.
That was going to be my question. What's the average time for the catch-up for performance in the elementary level? So my question is really directed to Carrie. You may not be able to give me a definitive, but just based on, what you're looking at in terms of when a student comes in, and especially if they're not where the district wants them to be, what kind of time frame do you give that child to get up to that point before making some serious decisions about placement?
So those decisions are part of our SRBI process, and I know we have that, I believe we have that on target for a future report, so I'm going to make note to look more specifically at trends and data over time. It's really individually each child. Typically, I would not want to see a child in intervention for over a year without taking a good hard look. But for some children, developmentally, particularly between K and 3, we really need to give them an opportunity to developmentally develop as little people. I mean, it could be a matter of how their pencil grip is developing that is affecting their writing, which then affects their response to text. So we're looking at the whole child and looking at their development as a whole, not just purely in reading and mathematics. So I'd say I would not go more than a year, and candidly, it's every 6 weeks we're looking. But in terms of lingering kind of a thing, we'd say, what's going on? If this really isn't moving this child's needle, we want to take a look. So we'll get more specific data on that, but we don't see children in intervention typically for a long period of time.
And we would never, I want to stress, these assessments are all important. We would never just use one assessment as our decision for a child. They're a human being, and that could have been a bad day. I mean, there's also that,
One other question, does the participation rate include all students? Is that the high needs group? It's everyone? Okay.
It's everyone, yes, and I don't know if I reported it. I calculated it out for each group as well. We have no anomalies. We have no differences. We enjoy strong participation across all grade levels, across all subgroups. That's testimony to, I think, to our school system providing appropriate positive messaging about what testing is about. It's not intended to be high stress on students. It's intended to be high stress on us to make sure that we're using the data appropriately to monitor our progress and develop a continuous improvement plan. And it's credit to parents for hearing that message and not getting caught up in, I think, a lot of the media sound bites that often surround some of this.
He's being modest. This is a testament to Paul. If you look at our participation rate versus everywhere, Paul will personally talk to any parent and speak with them about how we use this and why this isn't something to be afraid of. It doesn't always work, but most of the time it does.
You were saying, I'm sorry, you were saying earlier that it would be interesting to look at the amount of years in the district and the ethnic breakdown. And if you do that, I would like to see that. Thank you.
I had a couple more questions, although you guys have covered it. This may be the same question that Mark asked earlier, in which case I didn't fully understand the answer. But I love the way that you guys go back and you look at every single score and say, okay, well, what does that mean? That only went up this much. What's the intervention? And I think it's a testament to that these scores are going up in large measure, and that's really great. But what about the kids who didn't do well before the scores went up? That's pretty incoherently said. What I mean is, you're addressing, when you see a dip or something, you'll say, oh, that's a bad dip, we have to improve it next time. But what about the kids who don't know something because they're in that dip group? Do you see what I mean?
Sure.
Because you talked about the teachers who were going back to make up for things, and you said, no, trust the curriculum, but what about those kids learning the stuff they missed?
Well, I'm gonna give some comments. I see Ann wants to comment as well. I think I want to highlight kind of 3 ways we look at the data. The way that we're generally describing here at the board table in the public forum is I'm going to describe to you grade level data across the board. And the analysis of grade level data is really our best way to identify if the product that we're producing, our curriculum, is being delivered and doing the job that it's supposed to do. So our first big look at this is grade level, to say what kinds of tweaks and changes do we need to make in that regard. From there, we then certainly break down into school-based and individual teacher-based data, and you start to see some interesting differences as you get at that level, based on any number of different factors. But certainly when I start to look at trends across any one school, if they're not trending in the direction that we want them to, we'll go in and we'll say, okay, is there fidelity with the teaching of the written curriculum? Are you guys on the same page with us? Are you, Carrie did a specific piece with our elementary principals in math this year saying, we're going to make sure that we have consistently across every grade level 60 minutes of time dedicated to math, in the same way that we have been making certain we have 90 minutes of time dedicated to literacy instruction. And that change all by itself is expected to reap some benefits. When the principal gets that teacher level data and has a 2 or a 3 year trend to say, okay, this isn't just cohorts of kids. I'm seeing that Mrs. Jones is outperforming Mr. Vicinus with general consistency. I'm going to get Mr. Vicinus to go in and watch Mrs. Jones, and I'm going to develop some stricter supervision. Then at the student level, that's the piece where the teachers are on top of that with the student success teams or the action teams. They have all different names for it at the different levels, but that's where essentially the teacher is forming differentiation groups and attending to those needs. And in terms of how does that play out, I think what I would point to, quite honestly, I would point to our report from 2 weeks ago, where we had really some dramatically positive results on our SAT. So I would say that those dips, and the continuous efforts all along the way, and all the variety of different ways that we attend to it, to the greatest extent that we can, make certain that kids aren't getting, you got a 2 and you never came out of that kind of a thing. That we make continuous efforts. We know who those kids are. We have a very transparent system so that teachers can go back and see any individual kid's history, and continuously take a crack at it. So if you had something to add to that.
Thank you again for the question. But as Paul mentioned, today's report gives you a lot of information about proficiencies and how we're getting there. We also look at the individual student growth data, and that's another big piece that is very important. It's relatively new. We've only really had growth data for 2 years now. We didn't used to have that as much with the CM. It wasn't as apparent when we had the other tests. It was there, but it wasn't highlighted. Now we're getting much better and detailed reports on individual student growth over time with targets for their growth. So we can look at trends in that way, and I think we'll have some really good analysis of that as we digest it and get some longitudinal looks. Another piece I wanted to talk to you about, because I think it's important, this will be a math piece specifically, but we talked about, trust the curriculum, trust that what we wrote is how we should deliver, but teachers do have to make decisions when they see children aren't as successful to move ahead. So I've worked a lot with the math supervisors to find those points where we can, and this is a new word, I have never used this before until last year, interleave concepts. So I've asked the math supervisors to work with the teachers to find those points where these concepts will come up again. There is, for instance, you're working on integers, and you work on and some students are getting it and some students are not, but where is that coming up again? When you go to the coordinate plane and students are moving on that, it's negatives and positives and in different directions, and that conversation is getting deeper and deeper. So we do want to trust our curriculum, we want to trust our teachers when they can slow down and keep moving forward, but also look at those opportunities, because sometimes students just need processing time. They need a little more time to let these things sink in. Then they see it in a new format, and there are some breakthroughs. So those are just 2 points I wanted to add, because I didn't want you to get the impression that just trust blindly. There's a few things there, and I think we are going to be getting even better at that in the future. So I'm excited to work with the teachers and find out where those points are.
Thank you. I mean, I know we're never going to get to 100% beyond grade level for every child, and so we don't mean to sound like, right, exactly, we're holding you to that, but, I mean, it does sound the way you're describing it, that we're getting very close to the ideal that we talked about, I think, last year, about an ERB for every child. ERB, is it? IEP, whatever those letters are, for every child. I mean, in the sense that you're taking that, and I just think that's great. And also, I've read about some curricular programs where they take themes and then they'll integrate, the math and the science and the literature, and that does seem to be effective. So I'm glad you're thinking about those sorts of interleaving processes. Thank you. Another question that I had was about the DIRG B. Every single time we have presentations, we have the same damn chart with the scatter plots. And it's always exactly the same point. We are in the wrong DIRG. So, is the DIRG meant to do socioeconomic difference, or what is the comparison supposedly based on? And if we're really not in it, should we be arguing to move? What are the implications of this?
Chip explains this better than anyone, but I won't make him come up. But I did want to answer because if you were firing me based on our results versus DIRG B, I would be arguing with you that we're in the wrong DIRG. It's not used for anything. It's not used for anything other than vis-a-vis reporting. And in many ways, the simple fact is, yes, actually, Katie Roy and the School Financing Project did the whole study on what DIRG should be and who do we most look like. And it's not the schools that we're currently compared to. But that's who we're competing with for housing stock when people are looking. And so I don't want to get caught up in it too much because, frankly, I think people understand who we are and why that's an odd comparison. But it is at the very least an aspirational comparison because the other DIRGs that we'd be put into, we'd be sitting on top. And so the truth is that this is aspirational. We don't shy away from it. And part of that is it's our job to make sure you and anybody else that gets elected to this board now, 10 years in the future, that we understand exactly who our kids are vis-a-vis who we're competing with. But we want to be aspirational. So, yes, there's times when I get frustrated and say we're in the wrong DIRG. Overall, because it's not really used for anything, and it's old, and it's based on old data, and yes, there's always a movement afoot to change the DIRG, but they can't even get the, I'm sorry. Let's get a budget first.
Fair enough, and you're absolutely right. It's not when people look to see where they're going to settle, where they're going to live, these are the towns that they're comparing us to. The reason that I raise it is that we actually, you say that we rate comparatively well or we're favorable, but we're not favorable. I mean, our numbers are really lower than those other places by an impressive amount.
Lower but competitive.
Yeah, but I mean, we're talking, sometimes 10 points lower so again, I'm not criticizing us, I know we're a different group.
If you break us out and make us like them in makeup, and this is, if you want to talk about Simpson's paradox, Paul, but if you compare our groups at the same reference points that their reference groups are in the same points, we're not.
Exactly.
And so that's some people could jump and look at it in some ways. I wouldn't say it's that significant overall. There's a couple places, that it's foolish to make a comparison, but it's also, one of the things I've always appreciated about this board is you've never made the comparison between our wealthiest school, elementary school, and our poorest elementary school as far as their makeup, because you understand those differences. And so I think that's, I'm glad that you say it. I'm glad that you bring it up. There's plenty of times where I feel the same way. But overall, it's something that, whether we want to use it or not, other people are going to.
Right,
So-
and I guess my point is, I'm sorry,
I just want to go back to favorable. I'm just going to defend that. I'm sorry. So we're within 4 points for ELA, and you know, the blue line and the orange line there are relatively tight. Overall, we've closed within 8 points in mathematics, and we have been, you know, a dramatic difference, even at that level of performance. You know, you've heard me talk about the math scores, and even at that level of performance in the DIRG, we had been in the top third of all districts. So if we drew in all the other lines across all the other districts, we'd see the relative comparison, but it's, excuse me, it is aspirational in terms of we want to be better than our DIRG. So.
right, and I didn't at all mean to make you defensive, but in a way.
He's all choked up.
That's right, I'm so sorry. You all right? Okay. In a way, the aspiration is not just we want to be as good as the other ones, but we want to make real the claim that we're making, which is that socioeconomic level, et cetera, should not be a factor, that we should be able to educate all our children well. And so to that extent, it's aspirational as well, as to ignore the socioeconomic reality and still be up there. So again, it wasn't meant to be critical, it was just meant to try to understand it. I just have one other question, which is a little bizarre, but you had 3 key instructional practices.
Thank you. I'm glad you asked. Establishing goals to focus learning, facilitate meaningful discourse, and elicit and use evidence of student thinking. These are part of the 3 practices that we are focusing our professional development with all educators on across the district. At the end of the day, you can sum those 3 up by saying creating a more student-centered learning environment. If you do those 3 things, you will have a more student-centered learning environment. And while those are just sound bites, we have, through our professional development that we've already initiated last year, through extended leadership in August and then again in September, and continuously throughout this year, really delving deeper and unpacking that with our building administrators, with our professional learning and evaluation committee. We're asking that to get replicated across small professional development groups. So the hope is that our students will start to feel a much more student-centered learning environment where they're conversing with peers, the teacher is a facilitator for their learning, and they're taking greater ownership.
So speaking of people who take a little longer to process, would you just say those 3 things again? One was about critical thinking, I got that one.
Sure.
But
They're all about critical thinking in that way, but establish goals to focus learning, facilitate meaningful discourse, and elicit and use evidence of student thinking. If you look back to, I believe it was last February, we did as that 3-part series on curriculum. So in February, we had these 8 instructional practices that we identified. These are 3 of them that we've keyed in on for this year.
Oh, I see now how it fits in. Okay, great. Sorry, that was just ignorant on my part. Okay, other questions? Have we beaten this horse to death? Thank you. It really is impressive, and you can already see the impact of just 1 year of intervention, especially in math. It's very heartening. Thank you. Okay, thank you. And now the personnel report with Mr. Rick Ledwith.
Hello again. So the personnel report, as you can see, is on page 10. And this is a real brief report, and really just an extension of our school opening report. You can see that we've hired 2 contracted teachers and 1 interim teacher. We have 1 resignation. So we didn't add 2 new positions. We had those resignations prior to the opening of the school year, and then when we hired these folks, they were working in other places and had to give their notice. So that's why they started a little bit after the school year started, but we had folks in the classroom prior to them arriving. So there's not much to this month's report, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you folks had. We good?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Now we get to the routine stuff. First of all, we need to approve the minutes of September 19th Board of Education meeting. If everyone's had a chance to look at them, can I have a motion that the Board of Education approve the minutes of the regular Board of Education meeting of September 19th, 2017?
So moved.
Second? Second. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Was anybody not? Oh, right. Abstention. One abstention. Otherwise, all in favor. Thank you. It passes. Information and reports. Do we have communication reports from any board members?
Yes, I do. So I attended the CREC Council meeting, I think it was last Wednesday. And I think it's safe to say that the theme in the room was the budget. And basically what came out of that meeting was the council members felt it was very important for all of us to come back to our towns and really encourage all of us, and we've already done that, at least some of us here, talk to our state representatives and encourage our families and PTOs to do the same. But at that time, that was the budget that was on the table, and so we all know that that budget was vetoed. However, I would still say that we all need to stay engaged in this process. As Tom stated, this is very serious and going serious faster by the day, so I think it just behooves us all to stay engaged and really have those conversations with our elected officials. And then the other piece of information that I wanted to share is I want to give a shout out to the Brayburn Elementary School, the principal, Jeff Sousa, and the students and parents or families where they celebrated their hip hop family dance on the blacktop. I was just able to go by, I think I caught 2 songs, and the kids were really having a great time, and I think the parents were more elated than the students because they were taking the pictures, and it's funny because they will remember that once those students go on to high school, as Maddie and Grace are here, and then go off to college, where they can then look back and reminisce on the pictures where they were really having a good time on the blacktop.
Better for wedding pictures.
And I also was able to visit Charter Oak with their ice cream social. And I have to say, there were so many people out there that there wasn't one free parking spot in the parking lot, and all of the streets were lined with cars. And I want to say, it's probably safe to say that it wasn't just the students that were, there in attendance along with their families, but there was a number of community residents that was enjoying the festivities as well. And I think that's just a testament, to the school and what that school brings to the neighborhood. So I would just like to shout out to both principals and students and teachers and faculty to just say, keep up the good work. You're doing a great job.
If I could just add to that piece, I only saw from the outside of Brayburn, everybody looked like they were having a good time. But Charter Oak, where a number of us were there, everybody that I spoke to could not stop talking about how wonderful the school was. It was people who were local, it was people who were coming in from somewhere else because they were coming in for the magnet part. It was really impressive how invested everybody was in the school and how happy they were. So again, shout outs to them and to all the other schools that I'm sure have just as passionate families, but we haven't met yet.
I want to piggyback upon your piggyback of that. At Charter Oak as well, we got to talk with a lot of parents and the families. It was really neat to see whenever I spoke with someone, I made a point of asking, are you a neighborhood family? So many magnet families were there, and they're coming, you want to say all the way across town. It's 6 miles maybe or less, but the families made the trip. Their kids are going to school every day, and they're really involved in school as if it was a neighborhood school. It's really working out. From what I could see, the way it was hoped for and planned for, that was really neat. Everybody loves the building, like you said. It was great. And Brayburn, one of the things I enjoyed about that, I heard a lot about people love the tile. They appreciate the infrastructure that we're putting in there. Just that one difference, it really brightens the school. I heard that over and over. I had a chance to speak with the custodian. He said it's easy to clean. Really appreciated that as well. And one of the things I enjoy when visiting the different schools is learning about their personalities. And Braeburn doesn't have a PTO. They have a PTB, the Parents and Teachers of Braeburn. It's a small thing, but it's very interesting. And even the principal, Jeff Souza, mentioned when he first got there, yeah, that was a little unusual, but you get used to it. That's what it is at Braeburn, and it's neat. Braeburn has my heart in a certain way. I grew up in California, and to me, it looks like a California school, the way it's laid out like that. So it's always nice to go out. We've got some invitations outstanding as well for the future here. I hope we all can make those as much as possible.
Okay, so no other boards or organizations we want to talk about? So let's get the update from the high schools.
Good evening. So last night, many of Hall's sports team faced Conard. Varsity girls soccer won, and the varsity boys soccer team tied with Conard in overtime. It's always nice to see so many students from both schools in town come out to support their peers. Tomorrow is the midway point of the first quarter, and all grades will be updated and accurate then. Next Wednesday is a full school day only for high schools because it is PSAT Administration Day for all sophomores and for juniors who opt to take it. While underclassmen are taking the PSAT, Guidance is offering a Common App workshop for seniors. And counselors are continuing to meet with seniors and ensure that they are ready to apply to college or post-secondary programs, whether it be for the November or January deadlines. There are many events going on in the next few weeks. The National Honor Society is organizing a blood drive that will take place in 2 weeks. There's a financial aid night at Conard next Wednesday. Hall is hosting Fall Fest next Saturday, October 14th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. The Student Association reached out to the nearby elementary and middle schools and invited community members to attend. There will be a bounce house, a dunk tank, games, live music, a grill, and a 5-on-5 basketball tournament for Hall students where spectators are more than welcome. So if any of you guys have time to stop by, that'd be great. It's the Student Association running it, and it's always a big hit.
Thank you. And Conard?
Good evening, everyone. So I'll start off by saying that our language department is starting to announce and try to find students to sign up for our spring trips. Both trips right now are going to Spain, actually. So the Spanish classes are offering a trip to southern Spain, specifically Segovia and Granada, for example. The classic languages, Latin and Greek, are also traveling to Spain, the Barcelona and Madrid section specifically. We also, our next Principal's Coffee is on Wednesday the 11th, and really just invite more parents to come because it's a super great opportunity to have face-to-face time with the administration, their guidance counselors, so that's really awesome. We also have the notorious full day Wednesday of the PSAT next week, which I know the whole school loves. And college rep visits have begun at Conard, so we have representatives from colleges all across the nation coming in. Shout out to Marissa Berry in the Career Center. She's really doing a great job organizing this and making it available to for seniors specifically to have face-to-face time with these representatives from colleges. As Maddie said, the varsity soccer game was last night, a huge turnout at Conard. We had a donut truck, Fatties, I think it's called, came. That was SafeGrad, the parents that are organizing SafeGrad. They organized with the owner of that to have some proceeds go to SafeGrad, so that was a big success. So far, varsity girls field hockey today and the volleyball game yesterday, Conard won against Hall. Additionally, Conard Young Democrats is a new club, and they just started, and they had their first event this weekend. They were out canvassing in the Conard neighborhood for Sherry Cantor's re-election, so it's always good to see that we have our students working in the political process. And that's really what's going on right now at Conard. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you both. That's cool. Almost makes me want to go back to high school. Almost. Okay, future business. Future meeting dates, Tuesday, October 17th. right here, same time, same place. And then the next one after the 17th is all the way on November 8th, which is a Wednesday, because Election Day is the day before. Also a town hall right here in room 314 at 7 p.m. So please remember, I'll remind you next time too, that Election Day is the 7th. Go out and vote. All the municipal positions are up, and it's really important to come out. And finally, November 21st, which is a Tuesday again, we have a meeting, a Board of Ed meeting, again here in the Legislative Chamber, but this time it's 6 p.m., just to keep you on your toes. So Tuesday at 7, Wednesday at 7, Tuesday at 6. Be there. Any future agenda items requested? Okay, any comments from visitors? Most of you, I'm sure, will choose to go home, but we are going to go into executive session, and so we will stay. Do we adjourn and then unadjourn? Yep. Or do we? Okay, so we're going to adjourn so that you can go home, or you can wait until the exciting... I'm not, I know, but if once we adjourn, you want to go home, you can find out the exciting results of the rest of the meeting later, or you can stay. So, all in favor of adjourning, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, that was a motion, wasn't? Oh, I was supposed to say it's a motion. Okay, it's a motion, we passed it, adjourned.